150 years ago, in the early days of the American Revolution, the United States Army began to take shape, led by its very first colonel, officially commissioned in June 1775. This man built a limestone house known as Soldier's Retreat that still stands today on the banks of the Conodoguinet Creek in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. Historians have ignored his valor, and yet his leadership, skill, and courage helped set the standard for what the Army would become. In today's episode, you'll hear from a distinguished military historian who is on a mission to change the way historians view this man. My guest has traced his life and legacy, uncovering who he was, the elite Rifle Battalion he commanded, and the mark he left on America's military heritage. It's a story too important to be left in the margins. You will want to stay tuned. Welcome to the Wandering Pen Podcast. I'm Christine Musser, your host. Welcome to episode 31. Today's episode took place on Monday, August 11th, 2025. My guest today is Dr. John Bonin. Dr. Bonin is a distinguished fellow at the United States Army War College and has written extensively on Army topics. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1972 and held a variety of field and academic positions during 30 years as an infantry officer. From 2003 to 2020, he served as U.S. Army War College doctorate advisor, retiring as a full professor and the Elihu Root Chair of Military Studies. From 2020 to 2023, he served as a special government employee at the War College, focusing on theater armies. He holds degrees from Duke and Temple Universities in military history. Welcome, Dr. Bonin, to the Wandering Pen Podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today, and that we can chat about William Thompson, who very few people actually know about. He was the first colonel of the United States Army.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We're going to start off here, how you started with William Thompson. How did you find out about him?
Well, first, I'm a lifelong military historian with degrees in it. And I came here to the War College in 1994 as a student. And for over 20 years, I heard nothing about William Thompson while I was here. Then I saw an article in the Sentinel, the local paper, about William Thompson's house still standing. And you know who owns it?
Yes.
And I'm going, I'd never heard of this guy. And so as a historian, you get curiosity when you find out something you don't know that you should. Mm-hmm. So I started doing my own investigations.
Okay. And so where did you go from there? Just take us down this path as you explored William Thompson and how you got to. And then I know that one of the things I heard you speak on was the battle in Quebec.
Yes.
So
I started my inquiries like I normally do. I checked the official sources. And I've got connections with the Army's official history branch down in D.C. And they acknowledged Thompson as a general captured at Quebec, as you alluded to, but they didn't acknowledge him as the first colonel of the regular Army. And that's the distinction I'm trying to establish. So I started meeting some local colleagues. One of them was Janelle Giroux. And she had done some historical research in the area, and she had come across Thompson. And she's a mutual friend of Frank Hancock, a classmate of mine. And so we started investigating this. To include, they gave me a copy of a paper written by a local man in 1976 on the 200th anniversary of the Revolution, and also Thompson's Rifle Battalion. And it was not particularly great as an academic historian, but it gave me some clues. Then I found out that the Cumberland County Historical Society actually had a copy of his original commission. Mm-hmm. And so that perked my interest. I contacted several people about writing a monograph on this topic, and basically got turned down by Department of the Army. They weren't interested.
Oh my.
So that's why I went back to my old institution here, the Army War College, and they accepted my proposal for a monograph for the Army War College Press. And so that's why I produced it.
Thompson was appointed the first colonel of the Continental Army's Rifle Battalion. What made him uniquely suited for this role in 1775?
Well, the challenge was that the Continental Congress, which had been established in order to provide some coherent organization over the 13 rebelling colonies, they had decided to adopt the army outside of Boston on 14 June 1775. Now, there's no actual record of that in the Journal of the Continental Congress. So we assume that's correct. But also on 14 June, they made the resolution that I refer to in my paper, and it is in the Journal of the Continental Congress, that they wanted to raise 10 rifle companies, 6 from Pennsylvania, 2 from Maryland, and 2 from Virginia, for duty with that army outside of Boston. Now, they did that, I think, for a couple of reasons. They don't really explain it. But one, they're going to broaden the war effort, so to speak, outside of New England to 3 other colonies that currently weren't providing troops. 2, they wanted people from the frontier. And I'm going to make an opinion here. They wanted some people that were hard. They wanted some people that were rough. They wanted people that were ready. Mm-hmm. And they wanted people with rifles. And so that's part of the story, is why the rifle. I'll get to that perhaps in a minute. But now they've proved 10 companies on 14 June. They now start forming. Well, it's on 22 June that there's another resolution in the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. That's where their meeting is, in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. They then decide that 10 independent companies isn't the right answer. So they ask Pennsylvania legislature, which is also meeting in Philadelphia, to appoint a colonel, a lieutenant colonel, and a major to command the 10 rifle companies as a unit. Pennsylvania returns with the answer that it's going to be William Thompson as the colonel, Edward Hand as the lieutenant colonel, and McGraw as the major. So there's a quick turnaround. I just wish Congress would be as quick in resolving mistakes as they did in 1775. It took them only 8 days to recognize a mistake. So the question you ask is, why Thompson? Well, Thompson was a well-known person in the frontier. He was from Carlisle, had had several appointments, had served in the French and Indian War as an officer. He was a well-known surveyor, had worked for the Penn family, the proprietary family. He had served in several elected positions. He was now serving as part of the Committee of Public Safety, the rebels, as a colonel of Cumberland County. So he was not only a logical person, but he was a person from the frontier that could command these riflemen from the frontier. I find it interesting that they didn't want anybody from Philadelphia to be attached to this outfit. So, and he was also a young man, relatively young man. He was 39. So relatively young, relatively healthy, well experienced, well known. And so he became the optimal choice and was selected by the Pennsylvania legislature to be the commander of what then becomes Thompson's Rifle Battalion. And it's in the Army of the United Colonies, which I find an interesting phrase, because there's not yet a United States. And they're not using the term Continental Army in normal correspondence. So his commission is in the Army of the United Colonies.
Okay. So one of the things that, that got him in this role as well was John Armstrong when he battled Kittanning during the French and Indian War. So do you want to just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, he served under Armstrong. In fact, that's an interesting point about his life. He apparently immigrated here to Carlisle in 1755. He would have been 19 at the time. So a relatively young man, and apparently well-educated, because he's almost immediately appointed a lieutenant in Armstrong's battalion of Pennsylvania provincials, that has been raised to protect the province from the French and Indians during the French and Indian War. Mm-hmm. I can never prove, but I can't disprove, that he was on the actual expedition to Kittanning. Armstrong led that expedition, but Armstrong took half of his battalion. He had about 600 men. He took about 300 on the expedition. He left 300 back to continue to guard the frontier. I know Thompson was in command of one of the forts. after that raid. I think he may have been appointed before the raid, so he may have missed the raid, but was part of the unit that conducted it. So nonetheless, he and Armstrong were colleagues, friends, and later during the Revolutionary War, when Pennsylvania is due to get a brigadier general, the Continental Congress and George Washington are mulling over which Pennsylvanian to appoint as the first brigadier general. And it's interesting because I did get a copy from the official records. Washington's letter to Congress stating, I have two candidates. One is my old friend, John Armstrong. The other is William Thompson. And of course, what he doesn't know is he's even written these letters, Continental Congress has appointed both as brigadier generals in the Continental Army. So Thompson is definitely well known to Armstrong. Armstrong is his old mentor, his old colleague, but Armstrong is a much older man. He only serves about a year in the Continental Army and then retires due to health issues.
Okay, now, did he have any connection to George Croghan during the French and Indian War where, well, of course, the Scots-Irish were put in the western part of the Susquehanna River to keep the Native Americans from crossing the river and going into Philadelphia. So he was kind of tasked with that, along with George Croghan. He
was. He did a lot of surveying for George Cronin. Cronin was a well-known surveyor and also a man that lived in Carlisle. So these men, they all knew each other. So Armstrong did some surveys for Cronin and did some independent. He also crossed paths with Washington during some of these surveys, because Washington was also conducting surveys out of Virginia north toward Pittsburgh, whereas Crone and Thompson are conducting surveys west out of Carlisle, and they crossed paths in the Ohio Valley. And there was some conflicting interest. Washington at one point is questioning under what authority is William Thompson conducting surveys in the Ohio Valley that Virginia claimed. But yes, William Thompson and George Cronin are colleagues in business together as well as surveying.
Okay, so he also was at Bunker Hill and a couple of the other battles.
Thompson missed Bunker Hill.
Oh, he missed Bunker Hill. Okay.
Bunker Hill occurs before Washington arrives, before the rifle companies arrive, before Thompson arrives. And it's one of those things that is a reason why they needed George Washington to be the commander-in-chief. His appointment actually is on the 15th of June, 1775. The rifle companies are authorized on 14 June, and Thompson is commissioned on 25 June. So all of this is happening in June of 1775, but it's happening just after the Battle of Bunker Hill has occurred, and with the army in front of Boston that does not have a real command structure yet until Washington arrives and imposes one. So that's one of the frustrations, if you will, is the riflemen arrive after the major battle is conducted.
Okay, now, so we have the French and Indian War, and then after that is around the time that Thompson bought this property in Carlisle. So what can you say about Soldiers Retreat? It was just recently restored.
Well, I have had the privilege to be there. And again, I was there during the renovation to see some of the original work before the renovation was completed. And again, Thompson purchased this property in the 1760s. The exact date is a little fuzzy, but it was what they called at that time a plantation or a farm with other activities. Like he had a sawmill. He picked a spot wisely on a hill at a confluence of a major creek, the Conodoguinet, and another smaller creek. So he had plenty of fresh water. It was on a hill. He could defend the position. It was stone walls, really strong stone walls, the original building, and the wood flooring, the planking was done by a sawmill. So some of that is still there. Some of the stone walls are still there, even with the restored property. So the whole idea of that property, that was one of many that he had once owned, but that became his principal residence after about 1774, even though he had properties elsewhere. He had married Catherine Ross from York, and so he also apparently had some properties as far as York, but he had some further he had some properties even around the Pittsburgh area as it developed. He was an entrepreneur involved with many different business and entrepreneurial interests, but this became his principal residence here. At that time, it was considered Middleton, but it's now North Middleton Township is where it is.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Catherine Ross. Do you want to share a little bit about who she is and who her connection to the Pennsylvania history is?
Well, she was from a very prominent family, as you know. And so he ends up through marriage to her, he ends up connected to some of the leading citizens of Pennsylvania of the time. So again, he's a man of some prominence, having arrived here as a young immigrant with probably not much. So he marries well, as they say. And he's got relatives that are on the Continental Congress. So he has some political support in the Continental Congress. He also ends up on the wrong side of local Pennsylvania politics. He tends to be more on the side of the frontier people against the urban interest in Philadelphia. That's one of the reasons that causes him problems down the line after he's captured.
Mm-hmm. So would he have been considered then as an anti-federalist with the frontier people? Because one of the things with the frontier, my understanding is that because of this being a Quaker colony, rifles didn't necessarily go to the frontiersman who was supposed to be protecting Pennsylvania's frontier.
Well, as you know, the Quakers did not believe in militia. So Pennsylvania was the one of the 13 colonies that had not adopted the English concept of a militia or a citizen soldiery that had a responsibility to arm themselves and turn out to defend the province or the colony. And that was because of the Quaker influence in the legislature and the Penn family as the proprietary. So that's where Ben Franklin had to come up with the unique solution of what he called the associators. So the associators were volunteers volunteering to be a militia-like force here in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem was those Quakers in Philadelphia just assumed have all the Scotch-Irish be the associators out on the frontier to protect Philadelphia and not bother anybody in Philadelphia with that nasty military service. So there was tension between these regions within the state. Now, part of it also was taxation. The folks on the frontier obviously did not believe in heavy taxation of their goods. Later, as you know, that's going to become one of the basis for the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Right. Is that tension between those that are growing crops out in the frontier and converting some of their crop to whiskey, and the coastal elites, I'll call them. You know, we still have some problems with coastal elites. Some of the coastal elites that wanted to tax the frontier but not tax themselves. So he was more, at this point, the Federalists hadn't formed. So he's not a Federalist or an anti-Federalist. Those issues had not yet formed. But he was more of a out-country person rather than a city in country, and that had already caused some tension within the Pennsylvania Assembly. At one point, he actually fights a battle inside Philadelphia to protect one of his colleagues from being attacked by some of the Pennsylvania militia, mostly from Philly, that wanted to kill Wilson. And Thompson, that's one of the egregious things he did as a parolee. He defended his friend Wilson in the battle for Wilson's Fort inside Philadelphia. Okay, very interesting. Touching on some things there that I wasn't aware of. I mean, with my study, which is really good. So moving on then to Thompson, one of the questions is the Pennsylvania militia was feared. You want to just talk about that? The first Pennsylvania. Yeah, first they're not militia. Pennsylvania didn't have militia. Yeah, so these men mostly had been associators. So that's the other thing. Most of these men that are in Thompson's Rifle Battalion are previous experienced men in the Pennsylvania associators, the militia equivalent. Many of them had also served in the provincials that Pennsylvania raised. Now, the difference between militia associators and provincials are paid. And so they're semi-professional, as I use in my paper. They're not full British regulars wearing red coats, but they are semi-professional men that serve for pay. They're equipped by the province, and that's what Armstrong's battalion had been. So obviously Thompson is familiar with this construct because he'd been an officer, later a captain of light horse within Armstrong's provincial battalion. Now, the difference, though, is as they get to Boston, these are the only men, these 10 rifle companies and later 12, these are the only men that are being paid by the Continental Congress. Everybody else out there is New England militia that are technically not being paid because militia was a non-paid status. So that's one of the distinctions. Second, they've already signed an enlistment contract. All these men have signed an enlistment contract. They're all technically traitors to the crown. And so is Thompson, because his commission that's on display in the Cumberland County Historical Society is signed by John Hancock, and you can't miss that signature. So these men are traitors now to the crown because they've signed on as semi-professional soldiers to fight the crown in the Army of the United Colonies. Now, that gave them a little structural advantage, but they weren't disciplined. That's one of the other problems. These are some frontier boys. They got bored. They got in trouble. 25 of them were put in the stockade under Washington's orders because they came ready for action, and there wasn't enough action. So they are an interesting lot. But now their weapon, the rifle, this is a unique Pennsylvania product. Historians have later called it the Kentucky rifle. But they're armed with the frontier with the Pennsylvania rifle that gives them a much larger effective range, that they can hit a target at 200 yards easily, whereas your average musket of the day was barely capable of hitting an aim target at 50 yards. So they've got a much greater ability to reach out and hit a target at longer range. This starts to intimidate the British, especially the British officers, because Thompson's riflemen are going to start picking out officers to shoot as they expose themselves, and this is going to be an intimidation factor. It's what we call today an asymmetric warfare advantage. Symmetrical warfare is the same. Asymmetric, find a difference. And so this is where I think intentionally the Continental Congress and George Washington is going to use this asymmetric advantage against the British, because he doesn't have too many other advantages against the British.
Okay. Now, let's go ahead and take where Thompson ended up in Canada. So how did he end up getting to Canada and to that battle?
Well, first, his unit is originally Thompson's Rifle Battalion, named after the commander, which was a common structural thing in the day. Now, George Washington is starting to do in 1775 to form the army for 1776. And so he does. And so he forms the army for 1776 by re-enlisting all these militiamen, or most of them, outside of Boston into new Continental Army units. And so Thompson's Rifle Battalion becomes the first Continental Infantry Regiment because it was the first unit formed in the Army of the United Colonies. So at that point, Thompson is still the colonel of the 1st Continental Regiment. As I mentioned, in March, the decision is made Pennsylvania needs generals. And so they're going to get 2. They're going to get Armstrong and Thompson. But the decision is made to send Armstrong to the Department of the South in Virginia, and they're going to send Thompson to the most threatened frontier that the Congress is concerned about is Canada. Because we've already lost the battle at Quebec on 31 December, and General Montgomery, the original commander, is killed. So now we're going to surge more troops into Canada, and Thompson gets picked to lead one of the brigades into Canada as a brand new brigadier general. So in April, he starts moving to Canada. He's there by May. And then what happens is the British get reinforced, advance down the river, and the Americans have to withdraw. So they end up near a place called Sorrel. And Thompson is now the second in charge of the American forces, and he's told to attack the British at a place called Three Rivers. And he's conducting an attack with about 2,000 men. He has to cross the St. Lawrence River at night, go through a swamp, and at dawn attack the defending British position supported by naval gunfire from the river. This does not go well. Needless to say, there's all sorts of problems. Thompson, though, is leading from the front, and as his men fall back, he is still at the front and ends up getting captured. So that's the end of his Continental Army service, is being captured at the Battle of Three Rivers in June of 1776.
And being there, he did not get released for how many years? You want to just talk about that and how he didn't get paroled and
Right. There's a curious thing that goes on in warfare at this time, that frequently officers specifically and soldiers would be captured by their opponents, but they would be either held in a prison or a prison ship by the British, or they would be paroled, which meant that they could go home, because now you don't have to feed them and clothe them. So they would go home, but they could not continue to serve until exchanged. So Thompson was paroled in August of 1776, but he wasn't exchanged for 4 more years. He's not exchanged, and means he could enter back in active service. He could not do that until after October of 1780. And at that point, he's ill. So for the 4 years he spends as a parolee, but not yet exchanged, he can go home. He does go home. He fathers several children during this period of time. And he spends a lot of his time in Philadelphia lobbying for his exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the problem, where he runs afoul of internal politics. The other problem he has is he's a brigadier general in U.S. service, but the British don't have brigadier generals. And so there's a problem of determining who to exchange him for. So ultimately he gets exchanged for a Hessian major general, but that had to be negotiated because technically he was being exchanged for somebody of higher rank. Normally you exchange for equivalent rank, but that was hard because he was a brigadier general and the British didn't have those.
Okay. So you argue that Thompson's battalion is the original unit of the U.S. Regular Army. Can you explain why this distinction matters today?
Well, it should matter because the United States military is composed of many subcomponents, as we call it.
Mm-hmm.
There are the regular forces, the Army, Air Force, Navy, Space Force, Marines, and there's the National Guard. And we also have reserves. All 3 different components, the active and regulars, the National Guard, and the reserves, all have different origins, different stories, different reasons for being. The National Guard, we credit as predating everything, and we date that back to 1636 with the 1st Massachusetts Regiment of Militia, as I mentioned, was formed in 1636. So the National Guard is our senior military service in the U.S. military. But they're National Guard. And now there were militia, now we call them National Guard, same thing. So 1636. Now, what's the difference I'm getting at? Well, the U.S. regular army didn't come into existence until we credit the resolution of Congress on 14 June 1775, forming the 10 rifle companies that will become Thompson's Rifle Battalion. And those 10 companies are formed in the service, not of a province, not of a colony, but the Continental Congress. And so they're later called the Continental Army. And so Thompson gets command of them on 25 June with his commission signed in the Army of the United Colonies by the president of the Continental Congress. So they're not militia. They're not provincials. They are continentals. Now, the Army officially declares the Continental Army to be the origins of the U.S. Regular Army. So if you say the Continental Army is the origins of the U.S. Regular Army, then by definition, you've said that 14 June is the birth of the U.S. Regular Army, which the Army acknowledges, and that's the 10 rifle companies on, as of 25 June, that same month, commanded by William Thompson. So that makes him the commander of the first colonel of what will become the Regular Army.
Okay. So why do you think the U.S. Army has not fully acknowledged or preserved the lineage of Thompson's Rifle Battalion?
Well, they've preserved the lineage of the battalion as the 1st Continental Regiment, and then later as the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment. But what they failed to neglect in all the Army official histories is recognize that Thompson was the original commander. That's what they don't do. Now, I've tried to figure that out, and I've gotten various answers. One, that some of the historians said that, well, we don't like Thompson. I don't know how that affects anything. Second, they said that he wasn't a very powerful or notable a patriot in the Revolutionary War. And I say, well, what do you mean by it? Well, he got captured at Three Rivers. Okay, well, a lot of people got captured. He ran afoul of Continental Congress. At one point, he was censured by the Continental Congress because he was lobbying hard for his exchange, and he got censured by the Continental Congress. So he was not necessarily a nice man. They also said, well, he fought Native Americans. Well, I think a lot of people did that. He held slaves. He did. And people in Pennsylvania held slaves. I think George Washington held slaves. Right. So there's a lot of reasons I've heard. None of them are particularly compelling. What I think happened is he just didn't get written up in the pantheon of heroes when we were writing about this in the early 1800s, when some of this was now being written. He just dropped out of sight. He also died, and his wife had to declare indebtedness later and had to sell the property. So he did not die in a very profitable situation, and later there were some financial difficulties that his wife bore, and so that's another reason he didn't remain in the public eye, or she didn't remain in the public eye.
Yeah, it's a shame, but he was taken out so early in the war.
Correct. He was captured before the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
So he never actually served in active duty for the United States. They were still the United Colonies pre-Declaration of Independence. So that's, again, one of these things. He served early, and his active military service was over even before the Declaration of Independence. And he died before the victory at Yorktown. He's dead before we were able to make a decisive victory at the Battle of Yorktown.
Yeah, because he died in 1781. Yeah.
But before the victory at Yorktown is my point.
Yeah, right. So, looking at his legacy, if Thompson had lived longer or returned to command, how might history have remembered him differently? Would history have?
Yes, I do. I think it would have, because I think he would have continued to serve from that period of 1776 to 1780 or so. He would have been in active service. He would have been able to accomplish more that would have enhanced his reputation and his legacy. Second, I think he does give us an example of a patriot. When he joined the patriot cause, there was no army, there was no success, and he's now risking his life, his property, his status, his family. He's risking everything to serve the patriot cause. Now, he had become a patriot because of some problems he had seen with dealing with the Crown. Some of that was on the Ohio Valley. At one point, he had done some surveys, and they were for the veterans of the French and Indian War that had served with him and Armstrong. And the Crown made him reaffirm his allegiance to the Crown in order to get the property for the veterans. He refused. So he's already been radicalized, one would argue, before 1775. So he is a true patriot. He's not a summer patriot. He's joining when things are tough. He's joining when things are hard. He did hard service in Canada that was not, again, recognized. Smallpox was rampant. The army had poor morale. He goes up there to try to restore the morale and lead an attack, and he gets captured. So I do think that he would have been a good field commander later in the war under Washington, who lacked good field commanders. There's numerous other instances of generals failing in the Continental Army during the rest of the war. I think Thompson would have been better than most of those if he had served later, and probably would have been a major general at least before the war was over.
He followed his convictions, or his sense of, he had a belief in, freedom. He believed what he was fighting for, and what he was doing.
Correct.
In America.
As you know, the Scotch-Irish were not particularly fond of the Crown from how they'd been treated in Northern Ireland. So here's a young man who came here at 19 to make his way, to earn his success. And he had been working on the frontier. He served as a soldier. He had acquired property, and he did this all on his own as an entrepreneur, as a man of action. And now the Crown wants to, tax him for what he's doing. So he was already predisposed to be anti-monarchy. And so what happened to him on the frontier just continued that. So he is definitely a patriot, a freedom fighter, and is willing to put his name and his life on the line for what he believes in.
Right, right. What should listeners take away from William Thompson's story that still resonates in our understanding of American military identity?
Well, first, freedom is not free. You have to pay for it. And
Yeah,
Thompson did.
Right.
He paid for it with his if you will, his reputation, because he was never able to fully return to military service as he wanted to. He wanted to be an active patriot fighting for freedom, and did for a short period of time, less than a year, and would have been able to do more if he'd continued longer in service. Second, he was willing to risk everything for the country. And we didn't even have a country at the time. He's risking it on a promise, a belief that things can be better in the United Colonies, even though we weren't yet the United States. And so he's willing to risk a lot for that. So he's also a man of action. He doesn't just think about what one should do. He takes action. When others may have been reluctant to do something, he took action to accept this commission and to be up one of the most prominent people at that moment in time opposing the king. And so that's, again, one of these situations that many of us would be daunted by. Oh, the king might take action against me or my family because I've now joined the rebellion against the king. He wasn't deterred by that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, would you agree that the Scots-Irish pretty much built our country because of their experience with the crown? They pretty much had the mind because of their experience.
Well, I'm of mixed heritage. So I do have some Scotch-Irish in me, but also French-German. So I'll argue all of our European immigrants provided context for America, but the Scotch-Irish at this point in time were the ones on the frontier fighting for freedom, and were very freedom conscious, partially because of the abuse they had suffered from the English crown in Northern Ireland. So they're definitely, the Scotch-Irish are prominent people within the War for Independence. Even, we often forget, though, there was a lot of Germans in Pennsylvania that also fought for freedom. Okay. True. And the rifle, back to the rifle, that was a product of German craftsmen in Lancaster, so that the Pennsylvania rifle was provided to us by German craftsmen. So all our ethnic origins contributed, but the Scotch-Irish specifically were on the frontier. Most of the men in Thompson's Rifle Battalion, whether from Pennsylvania, Maryland, or Virginia, were Scotch-Irish. There were also Germans, but a lot of them were Scotch-Irish.
Yeah, right. I'm of German heritage, more German heritage than Scots-Irish, but I do have that Scots-Irish in me as well. So as a military historian, what's one moment in Thompson's story that moved you or surprised you the most?
Well, what surprised me the most was how long it took to get him exchanged. The story about that is somewhat murky. I've got correspondence that I was able to find from Washington requesting Thompson be exchanged. And then it went through a political process, because there were several people to be exchanged, and Congress was determining the priority of who to be exchanged. So this is where Thompson running afoul of the Continental Congress, I think, affected him from being high on that list. But I did find that Washington did request his exchange several times. Okay. And was looking forward to having Thompson return to military service. But that surprised me how long it actually took. 4 years. Let me mention another man, Dan Morgan. Dan Morgan was also captured in Canada as a captain. He was exchanged relatively soon and returned to active service, became a colonel, and then later a brigadier general in Continental service. So that's an example of somebody that was captured a little bit before Thompson, but was exchanged around the same time. I mean, exchanged, not just parole. And Morgan became a hero. And so Morgan is considered a hero of the Revolutionary War. I think Thompson could have likewise have been one if he had been exchanged. Not, he had already been paroled, but had not been exchanged earlier. And he followed the letter of the law, because in the letter of the law was if you were paroled but not exchanged, you could not take up arms again until you were properly exchanged. So he's following the law.
Okay. So now you wrote the book on William Thompson. Do you want to just share where listeners could get a copy of that?
First, it's a monograph, as we refer to these things. So it wasn't a full book. And again, scholars have different sizes of documents that we produce. A monograph is around 13,000 words, so it's not a full book size.
Okay.
And again, it's monograph. It's a single topic. So like my single topic was Thompson and Thompson's Rifle Battalion. So it's a narrow scope of a work. It is available through the U.S. Army War College Press. It is available free of charge online, and you have to download it and print it yourself. But it's the U.S. Army War College Press.
Okay. Now, if any listener wanted to reach out to you to ask you more questions or have you come speak to an event they may have, how would they get in touch with you?
The best way is by email.
Okay.
It's at bonins4@planetcable.net. That's the best way to correspond with me. I'm not caught up to some of these newer techniques. I'm an emailer. I prefer email because it gives me a chance to look at it and reflect it and then respond.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bonin, for being the guest here today. I really appreciate and enjoyed the conversation on William Thompson, and hopefully historians of the Revolutionary War and military history will find him and will give him the prominence that he deserves in American history.
And that's one of the things I'm trying to do. And I'm also at least trying to make sure people here in Cumberland County know about him, because he is a true local hero. And on Wednesday, I'm going to give a presentation of which I will be able to mention Thompson. It's not on Thompson, but it's on the history of Cumberland County to the new War College class that's coming in. As you know, every year we get a new class. And when I came in '94, I didn't get any Cumberland County history. So this is something that several of us have tried to orchestrate to give the new class at least a touch of history of Cumberland County. And I will be there to mention Thompson at least, so that unlike my experience back in '94 when I got here, the new students will at least know who William Thompson was, and I will make sure they know he was the first colonel of the U.S. Regular Army. I find it interesting that he was the first colonel of the Regular Army, and we educate colonels here at Carlisle. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's a interesting historic link that he lived here. His house is still standing, and his legacy lives on in educating colonels.
Yeah, that's pretty important history. Thanks for listening to The Wandering Pen, where every guest brings a story worth telling. From history to travel to the spirit of a place, these conversations connect us to people and moments that matter. Join me next time for another story that's waiting to be heard. So again, thank you, Dr. Bonin, for being here today. I really appreciate it, and thank you.
Okay, thank you.